There are moments in history when a single voice can steady a trembling world. Winston Churchill's was that voice. Gravelly, determined, and unyielding, a sound forged from the chaos of his own life. But before the world hailed him as its savior, Britain saw him as something else, a man of mistakes, a politician of arrogance, a relic of a bygone empire. He was born into privilege in 1874, the son of a fading aristocracy. The world of his youth was gilded, yet hollow. A society obsessed with appearances, tradition, and order. From the marble halls of Blenheim Palace to the strict routines of Harrow and Sandhurst, Winston learned early that greatness demanded struggle. He longed not just to belong, but to matter, to carve his name into the pages of destiny. Yet, destiny did not welcome him easily. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was brilliant but cruel, often dismissing young Winston as a disappointment. His mother, Jenny Jerome, dazzling and distant, was a star too bright to touch. In their shadow, Winston sought meaning in danger, in war, in words, in the pursuit of purpose. As a young officer, he chased the sound of gunfire across continents, from the dusty plains of Sudan to the hills of South Africa. He saw men fall, nations crumble, and courage tested not in speeches but in silence. Those moments shaped him more than politics ever could. They taught him that leadership was not about perfection, but endurance. When he entered politics, the world did not see a hero. It saw ambition wrapped in arrogance. Churchill's words were sharp, his confidence overwhelming. He changed parties twice, clashed with allies, and made decisions that cost him dearly. The Dardanelles disaster of World War I nearly ended his career and his reputation. Many called him reckless, even dangerous. Yet, through disgrace and exile, he kept writing, reading, reflecting. He studied the tides of history and the nature of power. He understood, as few men did, that the world could turn from peace to chaos in the blink of an eye. By the late 1930s, the drums of war began to sound once more across Europe. Britain, weary from the bloodshed of the Great War, looked the other way as darkness rose again in Germany. But Churchill and the man once silenced by failure could see what others refused to see. He warned of the storm that was coming, and for that he was mocked, ignored, and forgotten. Until one day the storm arrived, and the man Britain had cast aside became the only one who could save it. When the war began, Britain was unprepared, its spirit dulled by the illusion of peace. The fields of Europe trembled once more beneath the march of tyranny, and fear crept into every British home. In that hour of desperation, the nation turned to a man it once rejected. Winston Churchill, the loud, stubborn voice of warning, was now called to lead. He accepted not out of triumph, but necessity. As he stood in the halls of power, the air thick with uncertainty, he knew that history was not offering him glory. It was offering him burden, a burden he had waited his whole life to carry. The first days of his premiership were chaos. France was collapsing. Dunkirk was a disaster waiting to happen. Every map on his table told the same story. Britain stood alone. The weight of millions pressed upon his shoulders, yet in private he allowed himself no despair. He wrote, he dictated, he planned. And then when words were needed most, he spoke. His speeches did not promise victory. They promised defiance. He told his people the truth, that blood, toil, tears, and sweat would be their companion. He did not soothe them, he steeled them. For Churchill understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Still behind the fire of his voice, the man himself wrestled with exhaustion, doubt, and isolation. He was 70. He drank heavily. He rarely slept. Yet he carried himself with the discipline of a soldier who refused to surrender to his own weakness. Every morning he rose to face the impossible. Reports of bombings, cries of the homeless, letters from grieving mothers. He read them all. He answered what he could. Because to him, leadership was not command. It was compassion, forged in duty. The Blitz began. London burned under the relentless storm of German bombs. Entire streets vanished overnight. The sky glowed orange with the light of destruction. And still Churchill walked among the ruins. He visited bombed neighborhoods, shook hands with firefighters covered in soot, and stood silently beside families who had lost everything. He did not speak much in those moments. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. A living symbol that Britain would not break. But victory felt distant, his generals argued. His cabinet doubted him. Many whispered that negotiation might be wiser than resistance. That perhaps Britain should seek peace with Hitler before it was too late. Churchill refused. He knew what surrender meant. The end of liberty, the death of the soul of Europe. One evening, as bombs echoed in the distance, he stood by the window of his war room, looking out into the black sky of London. He said quietly to no one in particular, "If this island story is to end, let it end only when each of us lies choking in our own blood upon the ground." That was not rhetoric, it was conviction. He was not merely fighting an enemy, he was fighting time, fatigue, and the creeping belief that the light of civilization itself was dying. And so he fought with words, words that rallied a nation, words that made even the frightened believe they were brave. From the radio's soft static, his voice reached every corner of Britain, from the trenches of Dover to the farmlands of Wales. He gave people something they had forgotten: faith. But in the silence between broadcasts, when the microphone clicked off and the room emptied, Churchill would sit alone, cigar smoke curling through the dim light, and whisper to himself that the hardest battles were yet to come. The world saw a lion, but inside he knew he was just a man trying not to lose hope in the dark. As the war raged on, the noise of conflict became the rhythm of Churchill's life. Each dawn arrived with telegrams of death, each night closed with maps filled with red arrows creeping ever closer. He lived between moments of silence and explosions, his spirit tethered between despair and determination. By 1941, Britain was still standing, bloodied but unbroken. The Blitz had failed to destroy the spirit of its people, and Churchill knew that defiance had become their greatest weapon. Yet the war had grown larger than any man could imagine. Across the seas, America remained neutral, watching the flames spread through Europe. Churchill's greatest test was no longer the bombs falling on London. It was time itself. How long could Britain hold out alone? He wrote letter after letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, appealing not to politics but to principle. Two old men, two democracies, one desperate for help, the other hesitant to awaken. "Give us the tools," Churchill pleaded, "and we will finish the job." He did not beg. He reasoned, invoking the shared destiny of freedom, and slowly the tide began to turn. When America entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Churchill wept, not out of joy, but of relief. He crossed the Atlantic, meeting Roosevelt in the White House, the two men planning what would become the Grand Alliance. There, beneath the shadows of war, friendship was forged between the bulldog and the quiet strategist. They disagreed, argued, laughed, and plotted the salvation of the world. But even alliances brought new challenges. Churchill had to balance pride with pragmatism. He was now the elder statesman among giants, Roosevelt and Stalin. Both younger, both powerful, both unafraid to challenge him. He knew that Britain's empire was fading, that soon the world would no longer be ruled by London. And yet, he refused to let that truth dim his purpose. He traveled endlessly, from the deserts of North Africa to the snows of Moscow. Everywhere he went, he carried with him a small box of cigars and a vast weight of responsibility. He was more than a leader now. He was a symbol of endurance itself. And though the press still mocked his eccentricities, his whiskey at breakfast, his long naps, his unpredictable temper, the people loved him for his flaws as much as his fire. The victories began slowly. El Alamein, Stalingrad. The Axis forces began to crack under the strain of their own ambition. Churchill's voice thundered through Parliament once more. This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. The line captured the world. Britain had survived the storm and was now ready to strike back. Yet, as the Allies advanced, Churchill's personal struggle deepened. His health was failing, strokes, fatigue, sleeplessness, the hidden cost of command. His doctors warned him to rest, but how could he? He once said that he had but one purpose: to wage war until victory was won. Rest would come only when peace did. And in 1943, plans for that final blow began to take form. D-Day, the invasion of Europe, was to be the turning point of history. Churchill oversaw every detail, but deep inside, he feared the loss. Thousands of young men would die, and though he bore no rifle, he carried their weight upon his soul. He visited the troops before the invasion, his face weathered, but his eyes fierce. He told them that their courage would light the world again. He knew many of them would never return. Yet he spoke as if victory were already written in the stars. Behind the scenes, the tension between him, Roosevelt, and Stalin grew. Churchill mistrusted Stalin's promises, fearing what would come after Hitler's fall. He saw beyond the war, into the looming shadow of another conflict. The future he was building might be one of victory, but not of peace. Still, he pressed on. Every night he prayed quietly, though he never spoke of faith openly. He prayed not for himself, but for the endurance of his people, for the soul of civilization itself. In his quiet moments, he confessed to his secretary that he was terrified of what would remain of humanity when the guns stopped. He feared that man's capacity for destruction might have surpassed his wisdom to govern it. But then he would light another cigar, pour another glass of brandy, and return to work. He was, in truth, a man built from contradictions. Proud, yet humble, fierce, yet tender, cynical, yet full of faith. He understood that leadership was not about being right. It was about standing firm when everyone else wanted to run. As 1944 approached, the storm was gathering once more, but this time it was a storm of liberation. The world was about to change, and Churchill was standing on the edge of history, ready to unleash the final act of defiance. He looked out across the English Channel, knowing that the future of mankind rested upon those waters. It would be the last great gamble of his life. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself a moment of fragile hope, that perhaps after so much blood and darkness, dawn might finally return. The spring of 1944 arrived not with blossoms, but with whispers of destiny. All across southern England, soldiers trained under grey skies, tanks rumbled through quiet villages, and the air smelled of oil, sweat, and anticipation. The invasion of Europe, D-Day, was no longer a dream. It was a promise written in courage, and Churchill was its watchful guardian. He spent long nights pacing his war rooms beneath the streets of London, maps spread like veins of fate before him. He had seen too much death to romanticize war, yet he knew this was the moment humanity could reclaim its soul. Every decision, every delay, every word could cost thousands of lives. And so he argued, doubted, prayed, and finally decided. As June 6th dawned, the grey waters of the English Channel were filled with ships, an armada the likes of which the world had never seen. Churchill, despite his advisors' warnings, longed to witness the invasion himself. He wanted to board one of the ships to stand shoulder to shoulder with his men, but the king forbade it. "You are too important to risk," he told him. Churchill relented, though his heart sailed with them across the stormy sea. The day unfolded in chaos and blood. Men fell before they could touch the sand. The air was torn apart by machine guns, the ocean red with sacrifice. From his command post, Churchill listened to every report, each number a wound upon his spirit. He could not stop trembling as he whispered to his aides, "Do you realize that by the end of today, we may have changed the course of history?" By nightfall, the beaches were theirs. Normandy was secured, at a terrible cost. Churchill stood in silence, cigar unlit, as the news reached him. He did not celebrate. He only closed his eyes and muttered, "We have done our duty." It was victory, yes, but victory had never felt so heavy. From that moment on, the tide of war surged forward like a rising sun. France was liberated. Paris cheered. The world saw hope again. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met to shape what the post-war world might look like. Yet beneath the toasts and the photographs, a new unease crept in. The world that was ending might not give birth to peace, but to something colder. At Yalta, Churchill looked at Stalin and saw not an ally, but the next shadow. He feared that Europe's freedom would only trade one tyranny for another. He was right. But his warnings were drowned out by exhaustion and the intoxication of victory. Then came May 1945. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The guns went silent. Britain's long nightmare was over. Churchill addressed his people one last time as their wartime leader, his voice cracking. "This is your victory. It is the victory of the cause of freedom." Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, singing his name. For a brief, golden moment, he was not just Prime Minister, he was Britain itself. Children were named after him, statues planned, songs written. He had stood when others faltered, spoken when others were silent, and led when others fled. The lion had roared, and the world had listened. Yet, even as cheers filled the air, he felt something shift inside him. Peace, he realized, had no need for a warrior. The same people who once clung to his words now longed for rest and for change. The election came swiftly. He believed the nation would honor him, that gratitude would outweigh politics. But gratitude is fragile and memory short. When the votes were counted, the result was clear. Winston Churchill, the savior of Britain, was out. He sat in silence that night, alone in Chartwell, his country estate. The radio announced the victory of Clement Attlee's Labour Party, the voice of a new Britain. A nation tired of war had turned to the promise of peace and reform. Churchill poured himself a drink, stared at the amber reflection of his life, and whispered, "They have every right. I offered them struggle. They now want comfort." He did not curse them. He understood them. But still, it hurt. For years, he had given his soul to the nation. Now the nation no longer needed him. He wrote later that losing power after victory was like having one's home burned down after saving it from the enemy. The press called it the end of an era. Foreign leaders sent him letters of admiration, but he felt only the hollow ache of irrelevance. For a man who had lived in the eye of history, obscurity was a quieter enemy, and a crueler one. Yet even in defeat, Churchill did not wither. He spent his mornings painting by the lake, the soft strokes of colour reflecting the peace he could never find in politics. He began writing his memoirs, shaping the war into words, as if recording it could keep it from fading away. His books became his new battles, his pen the last weapon of the old lion. As the years passed, the Cold War began to loom, the very future he had feared. When he gave his famous speech in America, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent," the world listened again. He was no longer Prime Minister, but he was once again a prophet. For a time, he returned to power in the 1950s, but the fire that once roared had dimmed to embers.
Age had claimed his body, though not his defiance.
He would sometimes stare into the distance during meetings, lost in memory, seeing not the present, but the ghosts of the war he had survived. He often said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And in that, he was right. The war had made him immortal. The peace had made him human. And in the end, both were his legacy. The twilight of Winston Churchill's life arrived not with thunder, but with quiet. The kind of quiet only known by men who have lived too loudly. The war was long behind him now, its echoes fading into history books and fading memories. He spent his days surrounded by the English countryside. Chartwell, his beloved estate, where the air smelled of damp earth and roses, and the distant hum of life moved at a gentler pace. In the study where he once drafted speeches that shook the world, he now painted soft landscapes, tranquil lakes, the play of light on water. He used to command armies, now he commanded colours. It was as if, after years of roaring, the lion had finally learned to appreciate silence. Visitors who came to see him often found him by the window, a glass of brandy in hand, cigar smoke curling through the air like time itself. He would talk about everything: art, books, Napoleon, even his favourite racehorses, but rarely about the war. And when he did, his voice would drop, the old fire dimmed by the weight of memory. "I was fortunate," he once murmured, "to be called when I was needed. But fortune is a fleeting friend." The Britain he left behind was not the same Britain he had fought for. The empire was dissolving, colonies seeking their independence, and a new world, defined by America and the Soviet Union, had emerged. The world that once bowed to London's power now looked elsewhere. It was the march of history, and even Churchill could not stand against it. Yet, he never grew bitter. He believed that each generation must fight its own battles, and that no victory lasts forever. His own, he knew, had been won in words. Words that rallied a people, defied tyranny, and lit a candle in one of humanity's darkest nights. He lived long enough to see his prophecies take shape. The Iron Curtain he had warned of divided Europe in cold silence. Nuclear weapons replaced armies as the instruments of fear. But through it all, the free world still spoke his language, the language of courage, conviction, and the stubborn refusal to surrender. By the 1960s, he was an old man, frail but dignified. His walks grew shorter, his words slower, yet his spirit, the same indomitable force that had once defied Hitler, refused to fade. He would often sit in his garden, hat tilted low, watching the sun dip below the hills. In those final years, he said little. but his presence still carried gravity, the stillness of a man who had met history face to face and left his mark upon it. When he passed away in January 1965, the world paused. Britain mourned not just a statesman, but an era. His funeral, the largest in modern British history, saw kings, presidents, and soldiers stand side by side in silence. The Thames, which had carried his nation through war and peace, carried his coffin on its final voyage. Cranes along the river bowed their metal necks as the barge passed, an industrial salute to the man who had saved them all. As the bells tolled, London stood still. The same city that once trembled under bombs now whispered its farewell to the man who had taught it to endure. History, as he predicted, was kind. His name became more than politics, became a symbol, not of perfection but of persistence, not of victory without cost but of courage without compromise. Winston Churchill's life was proof that leadership is not born from peace but forged in fire. He was a man of contradictions, stubborn yet visionary, flawed yet magnificent. And in those contradictions lay his truth, that greatness is not the absence of weakness, but the triumph over it. His story reminds us that there will always be moments when the world stands on the edge of darkness, when fear is louder than hope and surrender feels easier than resistance. In those moments we remember his voice, gravelly, defiant, immortal. Never give in.
Never, never, never. The lion's roar may have faded, but its echo still lingers. Across time, across nations, across every heart that dares to stand tall when the night seems endless.
Because Churchill's greatest victory was not the war he won, but the spirit he awakened.